we don't always explain or define, explain, justify, and apply our research methodology choices. So, what I'm going to go through today is a research diagram that I developed in conjunction with one of my mentees. Research methodology is one of the modules that I teach to master students. And the reason that I find it useful is because it will help us tease out and unpack exactly what we mean even before we go out into the field. Now, this diagram can also apply to secondary research, to a desktop study or non-empirical research. But today we're going to talk about it from the framework of empiricism. So what I need to do now is to bring up the diagram and share my screen. All right, so now you're going to notice that different scholars call different components of research different things. And this is why identifying what you mean by what you say, this is why that is so important. So when we look at empirical research, we can start off by thinking about research philosophy. Now, research philosophy is actually a field in and of itself. Um, for example, some people might call it paradigms. Some other scholars may call it a worldview. But again, it's important to identify what you're going to call it. So, what I'm going to do is go through this diagram. And even though this is virtual, I want Dr. Sharma to feel free to interrupt me if any hands come up. We don't have to wait until the end, or you can jot down your questions as we go along. So either format is fine with me. So now with the empiricism, we know that it needs to be analytical and preferably critically orientated. So by that I mean that we want to start with the research problem. I've read several systematic literature reviews regarding different research components, for example, sampling or data collection methods and instruments. And in those journal articles or in the systematic review, it's been noted that scholars seldom give enough information connecting the research methodology choices to the research problem. And when we fail to do that, when we fail to criticize ourselves in terms of why we are making certain methodological decisions, then we make it difficult for the reader. We particularly make it difficult for emerging researchers who are still trying to find their feet in the field. And also by critically oriented, I mean studying something with a purpose that's going to make a change. In the work that I do, I rely a lot on emancipatory education and how to unlock one's own sense of thinking so that it's not just standardized according to what one has read, so that things are not accepted at face value, but that things are critically questioned. Because in the work that I do, I think it's important for us to figure out how are we making the world a better place to live for everybody in the world in an inclusive sense, and how are we developing our higher selves when we undertake research. Because finding out, accomplishing your destiny and achieving your goals, especially this is what I teach the students, can be indelibly linked to your career path. So also another component is it being historical and hermeneutic. So we don't want to look at a research problem just in terms of what's happening today. So now, of course, today the buzzword is COVID-19, and there's a lot of research going on about what to do about COVID-19. But COVID-19 is not happening in a vacuum. There are a lot of various factors that occurred that led up to us dealing with the pandemic that we're in now. So it's important to historicize. I mean, there have been indications that times like this would come. I know at one point there was a documentary going around where former US President Barack Obama was talking about 10 years from when he was speaking, there may be a global pandemic, and it's going to show us that how connected we are in the world. So the idea is to be prepared. So I think this is important when we start identifying research problems. We need to historicize. We all know about, the situation with coloniality, that, colonialism and settler uh, colonialism, none of these things were just once-off events, but these are things that left structural legacies. So it's not to blame anyone for what has happened in the past, but it's to historicize it and to look at it from an emancipatory lens to find out how can it be more liberating and how can people be more successful so we're not bound with things that coloniality would have left us with, like class, racism, sexism, all those types of things that make it challenging to have a fair and just society for every person. So now moving right along, there's a debate again about what all these things mean. Now, that's going to be the way for research methodology throughout. So now, one of the things that I mentioned to students and colleagues, especially the ones that I'm mentoring, is that the fact that so many scholars disagree about what definitions apply or what means what in research is useful, because this is where we can define and explain by unpacking it and saying this scholar calls this research paradigms, this scholar calls the same thing a logic of inquiry, this colleague calls the same thing a research strategy. So a case study can be applied in all those different things that I just named, because different scholars will call it different things. So this is the importance of debating that and pulling that apart. So now this list across this row is by no means exhaustive. In fact, this entire diagram is not absolute. It's not written in stone, but it's just a tool that I'm using today to talk about how to yield meaningful empiricism from the very beginning. And by the very beginning, I mean coming up with your research problem. Now, of course, that research problem is going to live in the literature. And of course, you will have conducted a literature review and come up with what the gap is in the literature. So all of that must be included in the research problem in order for us to determine at the end whether that research problem has been addressed and whether that gap is starting to be filled. So, some of the paradigms or worldviews that are popular these days deal with positivism, post positivism, critical realism, or transformative worldview, interpretivism, transformative. Now, you'll see that this is more or less lined up in a way that this first column, well, actually, let's go back over here. First, I'm talking to you now about research um, philosophy. Now, and of course, there are many journal articles that we find that do not indicate what the research philosophy is. But believe me, even if it's not stated, it's there. It's implicit, it's inherent in the lens that the scholar is using, whether they are conscious of their lens or not. So now moving down to this, we're staying with this very first column here. This next section that I'm going to cover in a second talks about various components of research methodology. And then as we go further down, we're going to talk about how to use all of this to get evidence-based conclusions, recommendations, and policy implications. So now you'll also see that it's set up in such a way to start to establish alignment. Whether you're writing a journal article, whether you are working on a dissertation or a thesis, whatever the case may be, this alignment is roughly separated into whether your design or your approach is going to be quantitative, mixed methods, or qualitative. Now, this in and of itself is a bone of contention because some scholars call quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods research design. Others call it a strategy of inquiry. Others call it research approaches. So I've created this acronym. It's called DEJA, DEJA. And what it means is define, explain, justify, apply. So when you start to do that with each component, it it makes it easier for the reader not just to make it through the work, but to make your empiricism more meaningful. So for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to look at these look at quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods as research designs or approaches. Now, some people call descriptive, explanatory, pragmatic, and exploratory as research designs. So again, this is the importance of defining, explaining, justifying, and applying. For our discussion, we're going to look at these as adjectives that tell about the aims or the types of research that you're undertaking. In other words, these components in this row will precede whatever the selected design is. So, for example, it might be a pragmatic mixed method study, it might be a descriptive qualitative study, it could be an exploratory quantitative study. So, again, most designs, but it's up to the researcher, the scholar, the student to decide whether their research is more exploratory, which could go with any of these designs, or whether it's pragmatic, which could go with any of these, or whether it's descriptive or explanatory. So each of these have their own definitions and own explanations. The reason that this is important in terms of the aims or the types is because it sets your study in the framework of you ensuring that as you go along through the various steps that you are doing just what your aim or type says. So for example, if you're using a pragmatic type, then you have to constantly be on the alert for the problem solving aspect of your research, for your research project. So now the pragmatism subscribes to a philosophy that there are multiple truths. There's no absolute set in stone, but the whole idea is to find out what works best under certain circumstances, and those circumstances must be contextualized for the population being researched, for the country, for the community being researched. Particularly with pragmatism, as well as with the other types as well. In this day and age, when we are conducting field work, it's important not to continue to subscribe to the various worldviews that separate the researcher from that which is being researched. In other words, in my view, it's better not to objectify the people who are being researched or the organizations that are being researched or the phenomena that's being researched, but that there's generally a link between the researcher and that which is being researched. So, in other words, pragmatism would not so much look at, that there's a separation. The epistemology, the ontology, the axiology for each one of these aims and types, for each one of these paradigms or worldviews is distinct. So, for example, the if you're looking at indigenous epistemologies, for example, which is a worldview that's very different from westernized epistemologies, For example, the distinction between a tendency toward individualism and a tendency toward collectivism. Now, I know I'm making broad generalizations here, but if you just stay with me, when you put this in a historical framework, when you look at centuries gone by, when you look at this from time immemorial into ancient societies and how people live with each other, it's easy to see that frames of reference or worldviews differ and had a lot to do with how people situated themselves in the world order, whether they were more concerned about dominating other people or whether they were among the people who were dominated in centuries gone by, some of which still exist even until today. So the point that I'm making here is that it's important to point out the epistemology that goes along with each one of these worldviews, the ontology, the axiology, which will then give you the research methodology that you would need. So now let me just take a pause. It's very hard. I mean, I'm the only one. I can only see myself now. I'm assuming everybody else is out there. I'm seeing some photos, but are you digesting what I'm saying? Can I have some kind of feedback through a raise of hands or something that you're with me here in this journey? Is anybody out there? No? Uh, Dr. Sharma, can you help me out here? Or can I at least see a show of hands that people are digesting what I'm saying? Hmm.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get an indication whether people are following me. It's very lonely out here. I can't. There's no one else has a video.
Kindly, okay. Dear participants, is it possible you have to be on your video?
Or maybe a few people. I just need to know that
Yes,
you're here
ma'am.
with me.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
you. I appreciate that. Okay.
Maximum, kindly I
All
request
right.
you all, please interact with ma'am because this is a very fruitful session only for you.
Sorry.
Yes, ma'am. Kindly continue.
Okay. Well, I need some feedback. Are people relating to what I'm saying?
Uh, okay, just a minute. You want to take
Is there a
feedback?
chat room here?
Yes, ma'am. I'm just enabling the chat box. Just a minute, ma'am.
Okay. Are there any questions so far? Any comments so
Yes,
far?
ma'am. They will write on a chat box. I'm just waiting.
Okay. Do you need to interject anything now from the chat box?
Now, ma'am, chat box is enabled. If any participant want to ask any question, so kindly you have to write it in a chat box.
Yes. And then Dr. Sharma, you can bring it out. I'd like to make this interactive.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah,
Sure, ma'am. Sure.
yeah, yeah. And yeah, I welcome your comments or your suggestions so that we are
Uh,
all working through this together. So you can see I subscribe to that collective lens even in the
okay, ma'am.
presentation.
Ma'am, you have to be just continue as the query
Mhm.
and questions will be come on the chat box.
Okay.
In the last, I will share
Mhm.
with you. So one by one, you have to
Okay.
be just answers the questions. Is that okay with you?
Well, I'd rather, because this is going to take me a while to go through all of this. So I'd rather you actually interject. If a question comes about something that I'm talking about, I'd rather address it then.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd rather address it then to make it interactive. Thank you. All right, so now for our purposes, we're moving on to strategies of inquiry. Now, as I said before, some scholars would call the quantitative mixed methods and qualitative as strategies of inquiry, but we're going to use what I have here across this column. So now for quantitative research, for strategies of inquiry, we're often looking at experimental designs or non-experimental designs. Now, of course, the experimental designs would be those that deal with labs and or may deal with control groups and the absence of control groups. But all of this should be unpacked in the research proposal, and then it needs to be synthesized into the journal article. Another strategy of inquiry often used for quantitative research is a non experimental design, which would be a survey. Now, I've seen situations where when a journal article is reporting on surveys, or even when a dissertation or thesis is reporting on surveys, there's insufficient information on the thinking that went into the survey design. And there's often a lack of a link between the survey design or the selection of response options and the research problem. Often the research problem is placed there and then we never hear about it again until it's time for the conclusions and the recommendations. How that research problem is being handled or addressed needs to come through in the various components, especially if we're looking at a dissertation and a thesis. But even so, it can be synthesized within a journal article or a book or a book chapter, as the case may be. So, but even the survey, how the survey came to be, and the survey must, the response options and the sections of the survey must be operationalized towards certain variables. And those variables should be identified in the conceptual framework or the theoretical framework that's guiding the study. So that theoretical framework, not both, one or the other, either the theoretical framework or the conceptual framework, must come from the literature review, and then it must be embedded in the way that the survey is designed. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get down here to the tools. So now for mixed methods, remember we're at this one here that's in the middle on mixed methods. And here, this is more or less coming out of some research methodology books such as Cresswell, excuse me, who talks about the strategies of inquiry for a mixed method study, which includes both qualitative and quantitative components, could be done sequentially, concurrently, and this transformative aspect can apply to either one. So sometimes I see in journal articles as well as dissertations and theses where someone will say, oh, this is a quantitative study because I use surveys, or this is a qualitative study because I'm going to use interviews. No, no. Those are not the reasons for determining whether a study is going to be mixed methods, qualitative, or quantitative. To the contrary, what determines what the research design is going to be, whether you're calling this a research design or this a research design, is the research problem. So I really just want to emphasize that articulation of the research problem can either make or break the document. So now getting back to here, sequential means, of course, that you look at the qualitative aspect first and then the quantitative, or vice versa. Concurrent, you collect different types of data at the same time. And transformative, again, is related to your philosophical worldview, and it's also related to your research problem. So if you are, for example, conducting research that wants to improve entrepreneurship, then the voice of the entrepreneurs, particularly the small, medium-sized entrepreneurs who are interested in economic development in various locales, then you have to state that problem in such a way of what, how is it that giving voice to those entrepreneurs can lead toward the transformative aspect of what the problem is trying to address. So again, this sequential, concurrent, or transformative can happen whether a study is descriptive, explanatory, or exploratory. It's not limited to pragmatism. This is aligned with exploratory, but of course it can also be with pragmatism, but would not necessarily be with quantitative work, although case study could go either way. So now with the narrative research again, or the phenomenological strategy, ethnographies, grounded theory, as I said before, some people call case study a strategy, other people call it a design, other people just call it case study as a method, some others call it a data collection tools. This is the importance of defining, explaining, justifying, and applying. So now, when you are selecting, let's use this as an example. Let's say it's a qualitative research design based on the research problem. And one of the reasons for that could be that you're studying people in their real life environment, and being able to collect data and understand things from um, regressive and regression analysis or inferential or descriptive statistics would be insufficient to get at the why or the how of this phenomenon that's happening in an organization or in a community, as the case may be. Let's say that might be the reason. You see, that goes toward the justification part of Deja. And then that justification must be linked to why that aim or type is descriptive, explanatory, pragmatic, or exploratory, or a combination of these things. Because it could be descriptive and exploratory. It could be explanatory and exploratory, or either of these could accompany pragmatic. So now the point that I'm making though is when you come down to the strategies of inquiry, you want to look at, okay, let's say this is your worldview, is interpretivism, which is where it goes along with social constructivism, where the individuals or the groups or the organization that you're researching are basically giving you their perceptions and their understandings of what is going on. So this then would need to be linked to whatever strategy that you're selecting down here, whether you're going to be collecting narrative information from these research participants, or whether there's some phenomenology. Let's say that there's some public policy that is a phenomenon that you're studying. So if that's the case, that public policy, uh, you have to think about how that phenomenon is related to the research problem, and then what type of philosophy is going to allow you to bring out the dynamics of that phenomenology. Or it could be with ethnographies where you're going to have close contacts with communities and organizations, or grounded theory where much is going to be arising from your interaction in the field. So, whatever is happening here, you must define, explain, justify, and apply, but you do it in accordance with the aims and the types of research that you're doing. You do this in conjunction with the design and the approach. You do this in conjunction with the paradigm and the worldview. So, everything must be linked from step by step. Next, we turn to the data collection
Sorry,
tool.
ma'am.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. One
Mhm.
Lavneet Mishra, she just want, can you explain once again experimental design? In the previous
Okay,
one,
and I appreciate that. Thank you for the question. Okay. With the experimental design, when you think about experimental design, uh, this could happen in the natural sciences or the social sciences. And for the natural sciences, for example, the health sciences or the medical field, it often happens when there's some work being done in the lab where there's certain chemicals that are being used to determine what works with what. For example, there's an effort now to come up with vaccines that deal with COVID-19. Those are experimental designs that they're doing now to come up with what would work and what doesn't work. where they mix and match different things in the lab. For the social sciences, it may be, for example, let's say there's research going on about a mental health issue, and they've come up with the intervention. Let's say they want to use transcendental meditation as an intervention for people who have been diagnosed as bipolar. And then they have a control group where these people participate in transcendental meditation, and then another people who also have group who also have bipolar do not participate. And then the experiment is the people who had the intervention of transcendental meditation to deal with bipolar, what happened, you know, or is there some kind of other remedy that or intervention that's used for one group but that's not used in another group? So how is that? Is that useful? Are we okay? Okay, well, come back if we're not. Hey, this is the thing about the virtual, you I missed the contact. Is it is everything okay now? Is that helpful?
Yes, yes, it's okay, ma'am.
Yeah, just ask her if she could please just send you a chat and let you know if it's sorted, or if not, we can return to it. Okay. All right. So now we're going to move into the data collection tools. So now, again, this is where Deja continually comes into play because, first of all, the data collection tools must be distinguished from the data collection methods, because sometimes there's no distinction, which can be confusing. So let's just unpack that a bit. So now, a survey questionnaire is a data collection tool, but administering a survey is a data collection method. Okay, an experimental design is a data collection method, but the way that they are carrying out the experiment, the execution of the experiment, is a tool. Observation, this one, far too often, and I serve on the ethics committee, and we often see that because we look at the scientific rigor on the ethics committee, not just whether the elements of ethics are there, but the scientific rigor is an element of the ethics. So, for example, let's say that a scholar said they're trying to get ethical approval, and they say that they're using observation as a data collection method and as a data collection tool. The problem there is that they might say that, but then they may not provide an observation checklist, which is the tool. Observation method, whether it's participant observation, naturalistic observation, or non-participant, whatever the type of observation may be, you must describe that observation, but then you need a checklist, which becomes the tool for undertaking observation as a data collection method. In other words, explaining the method is insufficient. You must come up with, what are you looking for? What are the items that you're going to have here with the little boxes that say yes or no to tick whether you see these things? Or if it's more open ended, again, what are the different aspects? You can't just go out and observe and you don't know what you're looking for, because you're going to observe anything and nothing at the same time. So that observation checklist must be linked to the constructs or variables in your conceptual framework, and then link back to that all powerful research problem. Because if there's nothing in that observation checklist that's going to help you identify what you need to know and what the ways of knowing need to be to address that research problem, is useless. So, what's important is to have the checklist as the tool for observations. For let's go cross over to qualitative, then we'll come back to mixed methods. So again, it's the same thing. Observation as a method, but then the observation checklist as a tool. Conducting interviews is a method, whether there are semi-structured interviewed, unstructured interviewed, or structured interview. Those are methods. But you must have reasons for that. Why are you selecting unstructured interviews as opposed to structured interviews or semi-structured interviews? And how is it that your choice of the type of interview that you're going to conduct, how does that relate to the strategy of inquiry back here? How does it relate to ethnographies, for example? How does it relate to grounded theory? Your choice of the type of interview must link back to this. So now the interview is the method. The tool is the interview questions, the interview schedule or the interview questions or whatever you want to call it. But it's the list of questions. Now, another thing that I see that often happens when as researchers we say, okay, we're going to conduct interviews and we have multiple types of stakeholders. Let's say we have some stakeholders, we're doing multi-sector research. Some stakeholders are in the business field, some stakeholders are in the government aspect, some stakeholders are in civil society. But then we want to use the same interview questions for all three stakeholder segments. Okay, I recommend against that as a whole. Yes, you want to have common questions for all stakeholder segments, common interview questions. But you also want to have questions that are unique to that stakeholder segment because the way that that stakeholder segment would give you data or help you co-create ways to address the research problem is going to come from their frame of reference as the business person or as the government official or as the community member or the civil society organization. And this is what we need. We need the multiple views in order to resolve these complex problems because these days problems are just not discipline specific. Even that whole discipline thing is an issue because now we're realizing that transdisciplinary research is what's really important. And if we look back into pre-colonial indigenous ways of knowing, all the functions were transdisciplinary. There weren't these rigid lines between sectors. There weren't these rigid lines between a human being and the environment. It was a recommendation that the sun, the stars, the moon, the oceans, the trees are all connected. We're all sharing the same atoms and everything. So now it's like it's a new thing, like it's a new age thing, but these are all indigenous ways of knowing that have been there all along that we need to pay attention to, even when we're designing our research, so that we can bring in these transdisciplinary aspects. So now, considering focus groups. All right, we have focus groups as a method, but why do you want to conduct focus groups? What is it in the research problem that's making an indication that you want to conduct focus groups? And a focus group is not an interview. I'll see some people say focus group interviews. No, no. The focus group and the interviews have totally different aims. In an interview, yes, you're getting a perception of the people that you're interviewing, and you can have a group interview. A group interview is not a focus group. Even those are different and have different aims and objectives. But a focus group, one of the purposes of a focus group is to get at the interaction among and between the focus group participants. This is when you start to register, and this is very rich of what is the learning that's going on here now between the people who are in the focus groups. What is coming out? How are the way that the different focus group members were looking at things? You can often see from the looks on their face that they're starting to reassess how they looked at whatever the factor is that's under discussion. The researcher needs to capture that interaction, the body language, the facial expression. These things should be part of the write up when you are explaining what happened in the field. So the focus groups, the group interviews, the individual interviews are all very different, must be unpacked. Documents and archives, again, these are separate aspects. But for the documents, as well as with the archives, the method must be distinguished from the tools. So you say you're going to conduct secondary research as part of this research project, which means you're going to go into documents and archives. Well, okay, but what kind of documents? What are the requirements of these documents in order for these documents to be included? This is taking you into the sampling aspect because you need documents with a purpose, documents that are meaningful to the research problem. What type of archives? How are those archives related to the research questions and the research objectives? Or how are those archives related to the hypothesis that's coming out in the study? So the research questions, the research objectives, the hypothesis must all be linked to or cognizable to the research problem and cascade down here into the data collection tools. I mentioned historical research when I talked about the hermeneutic approaches, so I'm not going to review that again. But we do need to realize that whatever is happening in this day and age is not in a vacuum. All right, sampling. Oh boy. Now, sampling is very interesting. Before I talk about the sampling on the empiricism aspect, I just want to mention how many times I've heard that, okay, well, I'm doing non-empirical study. I'm doing a desktop study, so sampling doesn't apply. Nothing could be further from the truth. There's always sampling. There can be no research without sampling because you can't research every little thing about whatever that phenomenon is that you're research or whatever that research problem is. So you're going to have to set some kind of parameters, even for desktop studies, on what kind of journal articles can be included. What are the criteria for journal articles to make a cut if you're doing a make the cut, or meet the criteria? What are the criteria for them to be included in a systematic review? What are the reasons for excluding them? Is it that they didn't have certain aspects that you're researching that is going to inform your research problem? So now, these are not the only types of sampling. And there's so many things that are not on here. For example, when you think about logics of inquiry in terms of whether a study is inductive, deductive, abductive, retroductive, these things aren't even on this diagram. But they're very applicable because these are elements that need to be mixed and matched with whatever your research design is based on your research problem. So these are the things that we want to think about in order to make our empiricism more meaningful. And it also allows the reader to think about not just replication, but transferability if it's a qualitative study. Because we don't want to say that, oh, it's a qualitative study, but because the sample size is so small and it's not representative, it only applies to this locale in this context. No, we need to move forward from that. Qualitative research has taken on its own dimensions. There's no need for qualitative research to hide in the shadow of quantitative. I've been in groups where I've asked people if qualitative research is empirical, and they'll tell me that only quantitative is empirical, and that is a fallacy. So, unfortunately, quantitative research over the years has been privileged over qualitative research. And this whole thing of absolutes in one way and positivism has, had its place in the world that is now being interrogated, fortunately. And researchers are taking on different lenses to know that there's not one way to look at anything. The sun rises differently every day, but it's still rising. And the way that I see it is going to be different from the way that you see it. And this diversity of perspectives is what we want to use to make research more rich. So, when it comes to qualitative study, and this is another reason why we have to be very descriptive and precise and link in all these different components, is because we want the reader to be able to determine, and I'm kind of moving down here into data quality control, but this diagram is integrated. We want to be thinking about trustworthiness. So, but to think about trustworthiness and these pillars of trustworthiness, then we want to know, will the findings of this study that we've conducted be transferable to other similarly situated locales in different countries on different continents? So it's only limited to one particular community because there's a small sample size. Qualitative research means that you use different types of processes and procedures, and it has its own merits. So that's a whole nother discussion by itself. So I think I won't belabor that for right now. But I just want to say that probability sampling is often associated with quantitative research, but it could be associated with qualitative research. Non-probability sampling is often associated with qualitative research, but it could be associated with quantitative research. And of course, with mixed methods, you're looking at both because you have to determine and indicate what approach did you use for sampling for the qualitative component of the study as well as the quantitative component of the study. So now looking at this, the probability sampling and the non-probability sampling, I often call these strategies and then I call these techniques. So it's important to indicate the different layers of your sampling procedure. I'm working on a journal article now about sampling and sampling and sample sizes and qualitative research and using this information to do that. And it's very interesting that in the various systematic literature reviews, scholars don't, they might just say they use probability or non-probability sampling, or they might not even say any of that. They might not even say what their sample size is. Or if the qualitative research, they'll apologize for a small sample size without realizing that qualitative has enough devices out there in the literature to stand on its own. So the point I'm making here is that if you're using probability sampling, what type, what technique of probability sampling? It's a big world. It's a big umbrella. There are various techniques. Is it census sampling? Is it simple random? Is it systematic or stratified? Or did you use multi-stage cluster? And there are many more that are not here. As I said, this is not exhaustive. But what you want to do in order to develop meaningful empiricism is to unpack this as you go along. Now, you might be thinking, oh, well, in my journal article, I have a page limit. I can't explain all this stuff. Well, that's all well and good. But as a scholar, you can figure out how to work it in, even if it's a one liner that's bringing together multiple things. Or you can insert some type of a table that's going to clarify what you did and how you went out and how it's linked to what your findings are. So, you know the saying, where there's a will, there's a way. Then for non probability sampling, again, so what? I mean, you got to tell me more than that. Was it quota sampling? And if it's quota sampling, why? And how is it that quota sampling fits with the in depth interviews and fits with the grounded theory strategy that you used up here? And how is it that quota sampling deals with the exploratory or descriptive or whatever type that you selected? Yeah, you're going back there to link up. Why is it? And as scholars, you know, we can, when we were first writing up a journal article, for example, we write a lot more than we end up using at the beginning. At least that's the way it is for me. So when you're writing out all these things, you can do this. But then when you go back to edit your own work, then you can figure out how to condense it and make it more concise. but yet make it more rigor. And the more rigor it is, the more definitive it is, the more justification you have, the more likely the work is going to be published. And the more likely it is that the reviewers will find less fault with it because you've taken the time to substantiate your various positions. So, volunteer sampling, how does that relate to, let's say, if you picked ethnographies? You see, so you want to connect the dots here. Moving to data quality control. So if you have a mixed method study, and the reason that I have this little fixture here is to say that, of course, you need all of this if you're doing a mixed method route. So, for example, you wouldn't just want to say data quality control, reliability, and validity and try to connect that to the qualitative component of your study. No. Why? Because qualitative research has its own dimensions of how to establish data quality control. Let it stand on its own and be heard. So, some scholars cite trustworthiness with qualitative research as coming into these pillars: credibility, conformability, dependability, transferability. And then some of these are linked to what reliability and validity mean in quantitative research. And then, of course, there's various types of reliability, various types of validity, like construct validity, criterion validity, and so on. So even these have their techniques, just like these are the strategies with their techniques. These are the components that have their sub techniques. And within a sentence, you can explain all that and link that to why your data can be trusted or verifiable. All right, so now let's just move on to uh, does that get bigger? Yeah, it does. Okay, thank you. I'm talking to the screen now, you know. Inanimate objects also have their own sense of being. So, okay, data presentation and analysis. Now, this is always the fun part. And of course, we use different data analysis techniques when we are presenting and analyzing data. So, for qualitative research, these are some examples of how data are analyzed and, well, mainly how they're presented. Because, of course, we use various software, Stata, SPSS, Excel, and so on, to come up with analyzing the quantitative data. Now, again, qualitative data has its various components, and these are some of them. But if you're going to use thematic analysis, you're really going to need to demonstrate how those themes are coming about through the research or through the data. So now, on the one hand, you probably had themes in your literature review that you were discussing. Well, those are not the themes I'm talking about. The themes I'm talking about are bigger than your research questions, bigger than your research objectives. And these types of themes are coming directly from the data, whether it's empirical or non empirical data. If it's empirical data through focus group data, interview data, group interview data, then those themes are coming through what the respondents are saying. And for me, it's not just counting the number of times a word is used, it's more so getting at the essence of what the participants meant. You know, the researcher has a big responsibility. And, you know, there's no section in here on ethics. Actually, doing this is helping me thinking, making me think of other things to add here, because the ethical responsibility of retaining the meaning that participants envision, of course, gets linked to your philosophical worldview that we talked about at the outset. But in addition, it makes the researcher bound to analyze the data, reduce the data, but yet retain the context that the respondent or the research participant meant when they said what they said. So, this is why it's so important to tape record or audio, video record uh, when you're collecting data through focus groups, interviews, or group interviews, so that the researcher can go back and give rise to what the respondents are saying. Now, as human beings, of course, we go into a project with our own biases, with our own thoughts, with our own predilections. And I recommend that it's good to just try to write those down before you even start going into too deep into the project, almost like making a diary or a journal of what your thoughts are about this thing, so that you get it out there and let it sit on that paper, so you're not constantly clouding the information that's coming to you with what your preconceived notions are, because we all have. And by coming up with techniques like this, helps add to the rigor of the study and helps explain how you acknowledge, recognize your biases, and how you try to set them aside and then make room to understand what other people are saying who may not think anything about the situation the way that you do. So, that technique would apply to any of these types of data analysis here. And again, whether it's critical discourse analysis or multimodal, whatever the case, it must be linked to the sampling. It must be linked back to your data collection tools, because certain analysis techniques relate to certain types of data collection methods and tools. It must be related to your strategies of inquiry and the aims and the type. If you're doing exploratory, then you know you're looking at something that hasn't been looked at that much. But you're trying to get lay some groundwork on it. If it's explanatory, you're looking at causal relationships here. So that needs to come out in your selection of the type of data analysis technique that you're going to apply, because certain data analysis techniques are more useful for explanatory work than they are for descriptive work, or vice versa, pragmatic, whatever it is. So this link needs to be described so that even when you're analyzing it, you're going to be able to analyze it consistent with the type of research that you're doing, a pragmatic qualitative study, for example, or a descriptive mixed method study, whatever the case may be. So this is how you want to stay true to what your type is. Although, of course, you could find that, you might think the type is one thing, and then the data starts talking to you and saying, hey, I know you thought I was going to be this, but I'm not, I'm that. So, this is why you got to be open to the data talking to you as a researcher, and letting the data lead you, not you leading the data, which is very important, because you're going to find things in your data that you didn't go in looking for. And these are the things that you bring out that could be geared toward future studies. So it's still useful. Or it can also give you various implications, whether it's on a management level or a business level or whatever the case may be, and how it's leading you in a different direction than what you thought it was going to be. So, as a researcher, we get a lot more from a research project when we use techniques like I'm sharing with you today, than just addressing the research problem that we started out with, because research can be expensive. Research is time consuming, it's money, time, people, issues. Now, with COVID 19, there's not a lot we can do with going out into the field, but things can be done electronically, things can be done virtually the way we're doing it now, which makes it even more important to find new techniques for unpacking the rigor and making sure that the various components are linked together when we're undertaking the research. So now, whether, and I'm going to come to triangulation in a minute, But whether we're looking at the quantitative aspects of a study or the qualitative aspects of the study, this cannot be done without an interrogation of the literature. Now, there are different styles for doing that. Different journals subscribe to different ways of that being done. Different universities look for it to be done differently among the master students and the PhD students. Research institutes have their own ideas of, how the data presentation and all should be done. But as a general rule of thumb, you're going to have to interrogate the literature. You're going to have to look at you. I'm sure you had a literature review coming to this because you couldn't have a research problem without a literature review. The topic is elusive. For example, if it's a master's or a PhD student and they'll come and say, Prof, I know my topic. I know what my topic is going to be. I say, I don't want to hear about your topic. I don't want to know anything about your topic. I want to hear about your research problem. And I wanted you to show me in the literature, where is this research problem? What scholar said what? Who studied what? In what country? When? Where? Why? What were the findings? What do we know? What do we don't know? What is it that we don't know? I don't want to hear about you studying something that everybody's studied this thing over and over again and it's a whole bunch of literature on it. No. So you had to have a literature review to get that research problem. But when you have now collected your data, you've analyzed your data, and now you're unpacking that data and you're interrogating it against the literature that you already had in that literature review, but that might be insufficient because there are going to be things that happen in this data that you didn't know when you went in prayerfully. Because if you didn't come out with something that you didn't know, I don't know how meaningful that empiricism can be. So the whole idea is new knowledge, not just confirmation. Confirmation of something is important, but in this day and age, with all the complexities of all the problems in the world, with all of us being connected in a global community, with the oneness of the universe that this pandemic has demonstrated to people who question whether or not we're all connected as this in a sense of oneness, not as human beings, but also with nature and animate and inanimate objects. COVID-19 has made that clear to everybody that, this is the way the universe is. Many people have, especially indigenous viewpoints, have subscribed to this for centuries and centuries. But now in the 21st century, in the global era, people are coming face to face with how real this actually is. So we need to take all of this into account when we are conducting research and recognize then that yes, we're interrogating the literature that we had already, but we may need to go and get some more. We may need to go look again. Now that this data has told us whatever it's told us, then maybe there are some complexities that we didn't understand before that the data is telling us. In other words, we don't want to have any data that doesn't have some narrative discussion with it. So now, often uh, quantitative research is presented, the deal with the um, regressions, it might be standard deviations, all the information about whether it's whatever type of tables, whether there are statistically significant relationships. I know, excuse me, I know you know what I mean. So all of that is used generally presented. Then after that's presented, then there's generally a discussion about what those findings mean based on those tables and whether or not there are statistically significant relationships based on the statistics that were analyzed. And then that would include literature. But in qualitative research, it's usually a bit different. And for me, I'm a big subscriber of matrix analysis. And matrix analysis is underused. But what matrix analysis does is that it allows you to retain the voice of the respondents from those interviews, focus groups, or group interviews, but you reduce it into matrices or tables. and then it helps you categorize it. For example, let's say you conducted 15 interviews, and those 15 interviews, let's say you had 8 questions for each one. And then you want to see how did those 15 people answer questions 1 through 8. And then when you start to look at the responses to question 1, you're going to see there's similarities and differences. And you can start to reduce the data into matrices, which combines what different, it might be 7 of those 15 people said something very similar. But that matrix can also help you develop those various statements. Let's say there's 4 or 5 statements that they all made that are different. But when you look at those statements, they formulate a category that's related to the subject matter of your research project. So, matrix analysis helps you pinpoint what's come out in the data. And then before and after the matrices, you would discuss the results of that data in relation to the literature, even either the literature that you had prior to undertaking the study or the literature that you went and looked up after you finished your study. So now all of this then is relating to coming up with evidence-based conclusions, recommendations, policy implications, as the case may be. So by this, I mean that in order for your empirical research to be meaningful, we need to come up with evidence and we need to be able to track that evidence. Look at yourself as a detective, and the detective is trying to crack a case and solve a situation. But in that situation is the research problem. So now at the end, here's a detective saying, hey, I cracked the case, I solved the problem, it's resolved. I know it's not fully resolved, but I've got this much. And how do I know that? What do I need? I need to track the evidence. I need to see, how did you get there? What steps did you take? How did the sampling help you get there? How did your data collection methods and tools, what was the rigor there? How did they help you get where you were going? How can I trust the credibility of the data that came out through the interviews? How well did you establish the dependability of what these people were telling you, when you were interviewing them, for example? With the validity and reliability, how do I know that what you set out to measure, that you were using what needed to be used in order to measure that? Did it measure what it meant to measure? I got to track the evidence now to see whether or not this empiricism is meaningful. So, as scholars, this is our responsibility as researchers. And so long as we do this as we move along, it makes it easy for the reader. But it's not just about the reader, it's about the world, it's about the universe, it's about our communities, it's about our families, it's about our countries, it's about how to interact with nature in terms of the research that we're coming up with. We know we have a lot of environmental issues that we're all dealing with, that that we want to make sure that but even the environment, I'm sure the ocean is really happy about the lockdown, because they get a rest from these human contaminants, of the way we treat our surroundings, instead of respecting it for the sacredness that it's about. But back to the rigor, yeah, we want to be able to track the evidence and see that you're making evidence based, not just credible or reliable findings that you're giving here in the data presentation and analysis, or but also the conclusions and the recommendations must be traceable to everything that happened earlier. Okay, Dr. Sharma, I think I'm going to leave it there. And let's see where we are.
Yes, ma'am. So, ma'am, can you take some questions?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
Mhm.
ma'am. Your session is so informative. Uh, One question is, ma'am, they want to see a full view of your research methodology map so that
Okay.
they have to understand
Uh-huh.
at one glance.
Okay, let me see if I'm able to open this more. Let's see, to get a full screen. Let's see. I think maybe this will help me. How's that? And can I make that
More,
a little bigger?
more zoom.
Hold on.
Is that possible, no?
Sorry?
If
I
you
think it's bigger now. It's getting bigger.
not a bigger, if we have no, that is okay.
Okay. Yeah, I tried to make it fit to the page, so I hope that's helpful.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Dear participants, kindly see if you want to see that.
Okay, but you wanted it all to the page, so let me leave it like that.
One question is matrix analysis like the SWOT analysis, SWOT analysis. Is matrix analysis?
No, no, no. Yeah, no, I hear the question. No, it's not. It's not a SWOT analysis. I know SWOT, strength, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. The
Yes.
matrix is actually, see, I don't have well, maybe I do. I can give you, can try to show you an example from a dissertation, if that would be useful. Should I?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So let me stop sharing this. Let me pull up one of my students' dissertations. Okay, so now, let's see. I need to go to layout. Um, no, I'm trying to go to. Oh boy, there's so many of these extra things from being on this screen. Uh, Hold on, let me find out. Oh, this is what I'm trying to get up here. And this thing is in the way. Okay, now it's out of the way. Okay, give me this, give me this, give me this. And you'll see all these things that we've been talking about are actually subsections of a research methodology chapter for a dissertation. You see the paradigms, the design, the strategies, methods, and tools. I actually use this to help students understand writing these dissertations. Okay, so now let me give you an example of a matrix. This thing is in the way. Okay, so now the student would have started out by capturing from transcripts what the participants said. So, for example, these are codes to identify the participants. And this says by communicating, you can show transparency, blah, blah, blah. So, what this means is this was reducible because these people all said something that was reduced into this while retaining the meaning of what they said. This is something that another participant said, and this is something that another participant said. But when you look at these as a whole, they all are talking about internal communication in the municipality and what that means in getting a clean audits. That's what this study was about, clean audits in a municipality. So the student would have gone through transcripts and taken what the people said and go through different levels of creating the matrices. But I'm working on a journal article about that. That'll make it more clear. For example, these are statements that would have been made by the participants. FG means that was the focus group participants. FD or MM, these were people who were municipal officials. Okay, so then when you look at about open communication, this was all communication, but it dealt with communication with citizens. So in other words, the matrices help you come up with the categories, and the categories then help get you to the themes for thematic analysis. So that will be traceable through this dissertation. How did the themes and here's the emergence of the themes later. These are the themes, but these themes, if you go back and look at all the different matrices, you'll see how the students got to these themes and how they got to certain theoretical propositions, which I think were here. Yeah. These are theoretical propositions, are things that we weren't really looking for when she went in to do the study, but these are the things that need further attention. These are theoretical propositions that need further research based on what came out. And this was for a master's dissertation. So that's an example of a matrix. Let's see. I can maybe show you one more. Here's one about good governance. So this is a statement made by a participant about good governance and accountability. This is another one made. This is another one made. But when you look at these together, mind you, these are focus groups and government officials do giving interviews. But when you come back to it, they all said something about transparency. So that's what I'm saying. Your participants are giving you the answers because they're telling you the role of transparency in good governance. Okay, so this is going on now into leadership and things like that. So yeah, so that's an example. The matrix. That's an example of the matrix.
Thank you, ma'am. This is the nice clip. So, ma'am, next is at what stage of research? Am I audible, ma'am? Am I audible for you?
Yes, yes. What
Okay.
stage? At what stage?
What stage of research should we go for the patenting?
Go for what?
Patenting. Ma'am, this is also written in a chat box.
I'm not getting the last word. At what stage of research should we go for?
For patenting.
Okay.
I don't know. What is it? It's patenting. Patent? No, not a patent. It's patenting. It's a word. It should be patent. I think so. Dipanshu, what do you want to ask?
What's the spell the word for me? Maybe I'm just not. Oh, patent. Patented. Okay.
Patenting, yes.
It's okay. It's all right. Yeah, we're all in this together. At what stage of the research should we go for patenting? Um, well, I think that's going to depend on the nature of the research and what it is that you want to get patent. Because you would have had to have done enough research to know what the patent is. And my suggestion would be, if it's possible, to try to go for it before there's too much publication going on, because then once you start publishing, and it's going to be more open to others. So I would say somewhere between when you know what it is, this new thing that you've come up with, and before you start telling the world.
Yes. Ma'am, next question. How to handle issues when companies don't share their information, saying company's policy does not allow to share this info? It is a challenge
Okay.
for research.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree.
Yes.
Okay, when companies don't want to share their information, well, I have several views on that. First of all, before you start, you know, requesting information about from a company, you want to try to find out everything you possibly can from the website, from any write-ups that have been done. You want to find out what kind of policies might apply or not apply to that particular company, you know, business-wise. uh, yeah, you want to thoroughly research them. And then you want to have as your ammunition, because it gets to be kind of like a battle out there when you're trying to get information. Why is it that you need this information, and how will it benefit the company if they share this information with you? In other words, what is the company going to get out of it? You know, companies are concerned with profit, companies are concerned with progress, companies are concerned with their bottom line. So they have to be able to be made to see the benefit. And in fact, the company might feel like, oh, they're doing you a favor by giving you information. No, it's not that. You doing them information by finding out what is going to help them do their business better. You doing something free for them that the consultation a consultant would be doing, that they got to charge somebody, somebody, they're going to have to pay a consultant to do something that you as a researcher are doing for free to help them. That's the kind of modus operandi that I kind of use to
Yes.
get them. And the more comfortable that a company feels that you know them, you understand them, they feel more comfortable with you. You know, it's not like you're going in there asking rudimentary questions that you could get off the website. That's annoying because that means you haven't investigated the company. I don't like to use the term investigate, but you haven't discovered, or researched the company and found out their value. Look at their vision, look at their mission, look at what they've been able to accomplish over the years. Find out about who their stakeholders or their trajectories, and the things that, how good have they been with corporate social responsibility. Yeah, you got to feed their ego to a certain extent. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, any participant want to ask any question, more question? And all are appreciates your session is so much informative. Thank you so much for
You're
this.
welcome. You're welcome. Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, and
Great
hey, I hope to
session.
come there one day. I hope to come there and meet everybody in person. I was actually supposed to come to India this year for a week long session at Chartergah, but COVID. Yeah. But anyway, I got to meet all of you, and I'm happy to meet you, and I'm happy to know you. And let's keep in touch and even collaborate on research would be
Yes,
great.
sure, ma'am.
Yeah.
Sure, we will
Yeah.
definitely do that. Thank you
Okay.
so much, ma'am. It is a
All
great pleasure to join us for this. We have to contribute in our research. Thank you so much, Professor Rufin, to deliver a lecture in our joint 1 week virtual workshop with the ICT Academy on learning practical research and skills. We learn a lot from you, from the Professor Rufin, and definitely furthermore we will do the collaboration on the research. We will do the work with you. Thank you so much, ma'am.
I'm glad, and I'm wondering, Dr. Sharma, if it's possible, because I know we're all trying to save data, but it would help me if I could give my university like a photo of all of us who are here now. So is it possible for people to come on for a second, and if you could do a screenshot? I mean, I don't even know if I know how to do that, but I know it gets done. Uh, how are we able to do that? Are you able to take a picture of
Yes, ma'am. I'll able to take picture. Even I will share all the things on your mail ID.
on what?
Uh, Am I audible, ma'am?
Yeah, you're audible. So you say that you're able to take a photo of the session.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I'll share with you, ma'am. Later on, I'll share with you.
Oh, okay. So you've taken it already.
Yes, I already take it, ma'am. I'll share with you.
Okay.
With the
Okay.
appreciation
All right.
letter,
Perfect.
I will share all
Okay.
the, if you want, then the recording of the session also I'll share.
Okay. Perfect. Perfect.
Yes,
Okay.
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you, ma'am.
Take care,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Bye.